This is Lesson 27.4, Hitler and Nazism in Germany. What policies did Nazi Germany pursue, and how did they lead to World War II? Once again, we still have College Board Topic 8.6, large topic, Fascism and Totalitarianism. Explain the factors that led to the development of fascist and totalitarian regimes in the aftermath of World War I. And again, the ideology of fascism, with roots in the pre-World War I era, gained popularity in an environment of post-war bitterness, the rise of communism, uncertain transitions to democracy, and economic instability. Fascist dictators used modern technology and propaganda that rejected democratic institutions, promoted charismatic leaders, and glorified war and nationalism to attract the disillusioned. And Mussolini and Hitler rose to power by exploiting post-war bitterness and economic instability, using terror and manipulating the fledgling and unpopular democracies in their countries. After failures to establish functioning democracies, authoritarian dictatorships took power in Central and Eastern Europe during the interwar period. Key people of Hitler and Nazism in Germany. Adolf Hitler, of course, Neville Chamberlain, Ernst Röhm, Joseph Goebbels, and Paul von Hindenburg. Key concepts of Hitler and Nazism in Germany. National Socialism, Nazism, appeasement, then the Enabling Act, the Axis powers, the Munich Conference / Munich Pact, and the Non-Aggression Pact. Place, Germany, of course. Time frame, let's say 1916 or thereabouts to 1939. And we have a quote from A to Z quotes from Norm Macdonald, who recently passed away. You know, with Hitler, the more I learn about that guy, the more I don't care for him. Intro. It's easy to think that there was something dark and unique about German society that made Hitler's rise to power possible. We often think that the German mind and the German worldview of the 1920s and 1930s must have been fundamentally different from our own. But as I have compiled this lesson, I've become convinced that we in 21st century America are not at all different from the Germans who lived during that time. Today's news stories and the commentary in it make it evident to me that we in our own society are every bit as susceptible to the same lies and deceptive techniques and practices as those people were back then. And that is why behind this lesson, lurking in the background, is always the now. Nazi Germany went way beyond what Mussolini could even conceive. The Nazis under Hitler established firm control over both the German state and German society. They brutally persecuted the Jewish population as well as many non-German peoples. They were driven by racial aggression and extreme nationalism. They aspired to vast territorial expansion, and they took the human race to its most destructive war in history. Hitler's youth. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. Teachers called him a mediocre student. He was described as cantankerous and willful and arrogant and lazy. He left school at the age of 16 and drew lots of architectural pieces of work. The popular myth is that if only Hitler had been accepted into art school, he and the world would have been fine, and we never would have heard of Adolf Hitler. But Hitler's failed attempts to get into numerous prestigious art schools are really just a symptom of who he was. They did not make him who he was. Hitler spent his early 20s directionless in Vienna, Austria, doing odd jobs, selling small paintings, reading like crazy. It might have looked like Hitler was on Skid Row. He was underemployed, he was unattractive, he looked malnourished, he was alone. But in spite of all of those circumstances, Hitler already saw himself very differently. He already saw himself as superior. He saw himself as one of the elect, to use John Calvin's term. People who knew him described him this way: full of unrealistic ideas, constantly in judgment of others, and enraged by their foolishness, passionate about politics. He condemned everyone: the Reichstag for its inaction, the working class for believing what the socialists and the church told them. He loved conspiracy theories about the monstrous evil of Jews. None of this is at all remarkable or unique to him. Anti-Semitism was ancient, deep, and widespread in Hitler's society. World War I started when Hitler was 25 years old. He was all for the war, believing it would give Germany a chance to show its toughness. He served 4 years as a courier between headquarters and the front lines, a very dangerous job. He suffered a leg injury in October 1916 and returned to duty in the spring, and in the summer of 1918 he was temporarily blinded in a gas attack. By the time he got his sight back, Germany had capitulated. Up to this point, the German government had been talking of nothing but the rewards of victory, right up to the point of Germany's surrender. So there was no warning to the soldiers that this would happen. Now, suddenly, reality was kicking in, and the Germans were looking at having to pay blood money to the Allies, the loss of territory, the end of the German Empire. How can we understand what this did to the German mind? Well, from a social Darwinist perspective, we have to understand that the German people had believed themselves to be among the world's winners. They had the superior intellect, they had the superior nation, they had the superior culture. And there was no way they had lost this war fair and square on the battlefield. The only other explanation was that someone stabbed Germany in the back, the most likely suspects being greedy bureaucrats, Bolsheviks, bankers, and Jews. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated to be replaced by a multi-party democracy with its capital in the small town of Weimar. Hence, it was to be called the Weimar Republic. And as we learned in Lesson 26.4, the Weimar Republic had to take responsibility for the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty. They had to take the blame for the war, they had to disarm, they had to cede territory, and they had to pay war reparations. Hyperinflation wiped out the savings of the middle class, labor unions agitated with protests and strikes, and veterans came back from the war to find no work. The origin of the Nazi Party. In the fall of 1919, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party. They were nationalist. They were tiny. Hitler joined as member number 55, but he was designated member 555 so that the group would look larger. Hitler was immediately put in charge of propaganda. His job was to hold meetings and attract new members. In meetings, he advocated for such things as the end of the Versailles Treaty, unification of all German-speaking countries, the exclusion of Jews from citizenship, sharing wealth directed at the rich, and the movement soon changed its name to the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, hence the nickname Nazi. They stuck the term socialist in there to attract members from the left. Hitler became close to a man named Ernst Röhm. He had been an army captain. He began to attract army veterans to the party, and he began to organize these veterans into a militia called the Sturmabteilung, the SA. And their mission was none other than to beat up communists. And Ernst Röhm also financed a newspaper with money he had embezzled from the army. Hitler's oratory skills were the Nazi Party's most valuable asset. He had learned what common people liked to hear from his time on the streets. And he had learned that people got bored with political, social, and economic theories and policy goals. Ordinary people didn't respond to objective arguments or facts. He had learned that common people responded to simple words. They responded to colossal untruths, as he himself later called them. People liked it when you could take all of their complex problems and blame them all on just one thing that was easy to hate. It didn't matter much what that one thing was because people lacked basic sophistication or discernment. As a reminder, in Lesson 22.4, we saw the same conclusions reached by sociologist Gustav Le Bon in his study of crowd psychology. Lying is an unfortunate part of politics. Even the most well-meaning, dignified, and principled politicians find themselves twisting the truth regularly. But propagandists like Hitler and many others actually enjoy lying. They love the effect it has on the crowd. They love testing the limits of what they can get away with. They feel good about the lies they tell. And the bigger the lies, the better they feel. They even enjoy being called out for their lies. Sometimes they even laugh out loud when it happens. That's when they get to show their audiences how much contempt they have for those who think they can silence them. And they get to portray themselves as the brave, defiant victims of cancel culture, to use a modern term, rather than as the victimizers and the liars that they themselves truly are. They get to be seen standing up to powerful foes, and their audiences eat it up. Hitler's goal was to create hatred for traitors. He returned constantly to anti-Semitism. Friedrich Nietzsche, from Lesson 26.1, called anti-Semitism the ideology of those who feel cheated. And perhaps this explains the enduring appeal of anti-Semitism. It just feels good to be told your circumstances have nothing to do with any shortcomings on your part. You are suffering because you have been cheated out of what you are entitled to by people who are inferior to you. Hitler's speeches were full of action words like smash and destroy and annihilate and kill. He would go into a rage of shouting and arms waving around, and then, with perfect timing, he would calm down again and describe the better world that could be. Hitler's appearance. One of the things you always hear people say about Hitler is that he didn't fit the physical profile of the Aryan race that he glorified, and that automatically disqualifies him. He didn't have blonde hair, though he did have blue eyes. He didn't have chiseled features. He wasn't tall, he was about 5'8", or athletic. And our conclusion from this tends to be, what a hypocrite he was. How could people not see through this illusion that he created about the Aryan ideal? But Hitler's physical appearance actually worked in his favor. It made him seem more genuine and authentic rather than less. Hitler made himself out to be a true representative of the people, and authenticity is king in politics. He was a working man and a veteran. He didn't have a big bank account and investment income like the rich did. He didn't live in a big mansion. Recent history shows that you don't even have to hide outrageous words and corrupt immoral behavior as long as the people see you as authentic and as a leader who tells it like it is. Hitler showed a host of imitators in the decades since that if you can project authenticity to your audience, you can lie openly and unabashedly about yourself and your enemies. And you can convince people whom you despise that you love them and care about them and that they are special to you. Mussolini's influence. Using Mussolini's example, Hitler's SA started wearing brown shirts. The black shirt idea was obviously already taken. Hence, these stormtroopers started to be called brown shirts. Hitler also adopted Mussolini's stiff-arm salute. The Nazi flag. Hitler designed the new flag himself based upon the colors of the previous German Empire flag. Red represented the social thought of the party. White represented the national thought. The black swastika represented the struggle for the victory of Aryan mankind. The swastika had originally been an ancient Indo-European talisman symbolizing good luck and prosperity. The beer hall putsch. In 1923, the Nazis tried to stage a coup. A putsch is the German word for coup, by taking over the German state of Bavaria. The plan depended on the army's support, which they didn't get, and the leaders, including Hitler, were all arrested. At his trial, Hitler gained national attention by being the only one who was completely outspoken about his motives and his hatred for the Weimar government. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was released after 13 months. And in prison, Hitler was treated practically as an honored guest, and he received a constant stream of admiring visitors, and he worked on his book. Mein Kampf. Hitler walked out of prison with a manuscript that he called 4.5 Years of Struggle Against Lies, Stupidity, and Cowardice. It was actually his publisher who cleaned up the title considerably by changing it simply to My Struggle. In German, this translates to Mein Kampf. It was a jumbled litany of all of Hitler's grievances, hatreds, racism, conspiracies, and evil plans for Europe and the world. Later, this book would be taught to school children all over Nazi Germany as if it were their sacred Bible. The Beer Hall Putsch taught Hitler that he needed to pursue power by a different means than just violence. So he turned to a new approach that he called a policy of legitimacy. This policy did not rule out violence, but in addition, the Nazi Party needed a political structure that looked more legitimate. By 1929, the Nazis had a much broader nationwide apparatus. They owned their own newspapers. They had special clubs for young people and women, and teachers, lawyers, and doctors. Hitler's speeches were getting national support. He had announced war reparations as an admission of guilt. He denounced the British and the French for keeping Germany poor and weak. He denounced politicians for ignoring the needs of the people. He vehemently attacked the communists. He was getting lots of support from business interests, and he was also getting favorable media coverage. The problem for the Nazis throughout the late 1920s was that the economy was actually getting better. The better the economy, the less interested Germans were in Hitler's politics of grievance, anger, and hatred. Hitler could not grow the Nazis beyond the status of being just a minor party. The Great Depression. The global depression hit around 1930, as we know. No more credit was available for business. Global markets shrank. Exports were down. Production declined. Unemployment quadrupled. Businesses shut down. The Reichstag was deadlocked over what to do. And Hitler got to be the one to say, "I told you so." Economic bad news was political good news for the Nazi Party. In September 1930, the Nazi Party's number of seats went up in parliamentary elections. Women, small business owners, peasants, and the young all voted for Nazis in large numbers. The Nazi Party went from being the 9th largest party in the Reichstag to being the 2nd largest. Only the Social Democrats were bigger. The Communist Party also gained seats. Obviously, as we saw in Italy, the politics of Germany were becoming more polarized and extreme as the old school center was collapsing. The president was the elderly and anachronistic General Paul von Hindenburg, and this meant that he had a major role in choosing a chancellor to run the executive branch of the government. He ran one more time for president in 1932 and defeated Hitler, who was running against him. However, the Nazi parliamentary vote rose again. This time, they were at 100 seats larger than any other party. They had 44% of the seats in the Reichstag. Hindenburg invited Hitler to form a coalition government with him. Hitler demanded full executive power, in other words, being named as chancellor. Hindenburg refused, and the country went into another round of runoff elections. However, the Nazis did well enough again to keep their leverage, and Paul von Hindenburg had 3 choices. He could form a coalition government with the Communist Party, he could form a coalition government with the Nazi Party, or he could keep having endless runoff elections. Hindenburg's son, Oskar, a committed Nazi, persuaded his father to go with Hitler. So in January 1933, Paul von Hindenburg made Hitler the Chancellor of Germany. Just as with Mussolini, Hitler was given power by an elderly man who felt he had no options. Just as with Mussolini, it was totally constitutional, and just as with Mussolini, Hitler got power without a majority vote. One big lesson from Hitler's path to power is never underestimate an amateur. Germany's political establishment consisted of 3 main institutions: big business, the military, and the church. At first, they viewed the Nazis as mere hooligans. What chance could they possibly have at getting national support? As the Nazis grew in numbers and in legitimacy, the establishment viewed them as a useful right-wing counterweight against the left-wing communists. Why did these old guard establishment people underestimate Hitler? He had a lack of education. He was clearly an amateur, but he could disarm people with his charm, and he was a very reassuring liar. But Hitler was also keenly aware of how they saw him, as someone they could control, use, and discard when they wanted to. But he had other plans for himself and for them. A letter he wrote to a colleague on this very question in February 1933 said a lot about Hitler as a person. The reactionary forces believe they have me on the lead. I know they hope I will achieve my own ruin by mismanagement. Our great opportunity lies in acting before they do. We have no scruples, no bourgeois hesitations. They regard me as an uneducated barbarian. Yes, we are barbarians. We want to be barbarians. It's an honorable title. The Enabling Act, 1933. In February 1933, the Reichstag building was partially destroyed by a fire. This was the perfect opportunity for Hitler to make the move he talked about in that letter. He had the opportunity to turn Germany into a one-party state, a hallmark of fascism, as we know. Hitler first pinned the fire on the communists. He got the Communist Party outlawed and had all the representatives arrested. This turned his 44% Nazi representation in the Reichstag into a Nazi legislative majority. And with that majority, Hitler was able to push through the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933. The Enabling Act gave Hitler dictatorial power for the next 4 years. And boy, did he use it to systematically destroy every democratic institution Germany had left. He abolished local representative assemblies and replaced state governors with Nazis. He sent SA thugs to beat up political opponents. He opened these new facilities called concentration camps to hold some of his more extreme political opponents. Hitler really did a number on labor unions. He declared May 1st, 1933, a paid national holiday. Then, while everyone was at home for the day off, he sent Nazis to permanently occupy union offices all over the country. And he also purged the civil service of disloyal employees. He issued a decree banning Jews from the professions. He placed all theater, music, and radio production under the control of his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. He barred unsupportive journalists from doing their jobs, and he created the Gestapo. That is short for Geheime Staatspolizei, and it means secret state police. He consolidated 3 functions in the Gestapo: intelligence, political surveillance, and police. The Night of the Long Knives. Hitler's longtime ally Ernst Röhm was still in charge of the SA, the Sturmabteilung. And with about 3 million brown shirts, the SA was actually bigger than the regular German army. The Nazi Party had used the SA as a force to remove obstacles to the path of power. But now that the Nazis were in power, in charge of a one-party state, there were no other obstacles for the SA to put down. And Ernst Röhm wanted the SA to replace the entire regular army by rewarding SA leaders with top military positions. But the Nazis wanted to reduce the size of the SA. Hitler tried to reason with Ernst Röhm. Röhm argued and even made an obscure threat to Hitler, suggesting that he would assign more firepower to the Capitol building. At this, Hitler knew what he had to do with the SA: strike first. On June 4th, 1933, Hitler persuaded Röhm to give the SA a month leave, and then they would make any new decisions after the SA returned to duty. Ernst Röhm bought into Hitler's deception and sent his entire SA force home. Over the weekend of June 30th, Hitler's SS launched Operation Hummingbird. This event is also known as the Night of the Long Knives. The SS stood for Schutzstaffel, Protection Squad, and was headed by Heinrich Himmler. They were smaller, more professional, and more efficient than the SA. Ernst Röhm and about 100 other leaders were rounded up and killed. This got the military on Hitler's side, and it also cleared the way for Hitler to make himself Führer after Hindenburg soon died of natural causes. Der Führer. Führer is German simply for leader. After Hindenburg's death and the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler now had 3 positions. He was head of state, president, he was head of government, chancellor, and he was commander-in-chief of the military. And the army was required to swear allegiance, not to the country, not to a constitution, but to the Führer personally. Propaganda. Germans received constant propaganda at the workplace, at public rallies, and especially on the radio. Hitler was the first dictator who could reach 80 million people at once. Unlike social media today, it was one way, so you had total control over it. It was the most efficient tool for manipulation of the human mind up to that point. Hitler's speeches became global events. Hitler and the military. When Hitler took power, the army was small and lacked modern equipment. The Navy and Air Force barely existed. But Hitler already knew he planned on instigating massive war fairly soon. So he plunged into a massive, somewhat covert rearmament program. The economy started to improve in his first 2 years in power. Unemployment was cut in half. 3 million new jobs were created. Arms production was leading the way. Hitler already had a steady supply of lies ready to explain away his rearming of Germany to the world. That his intentions were peaceful, that he simply wanted to redress the unfair treatment that Germany had received after World War I. Each step Hitler took was supposedly the last step, and Germany would be satisfied and go no further. Hitler and academics. Hitler needed to take control of the German mind. He needed a population that would go along with the vilest, cruelest things he could think of, and obey without hesitation. He literally wanted to make Germans dumber and more ignorant. Radio and newspapers gave Hitler tremendous control over the day-to-day information they were getting. But he also needed to get a handle on the ideas that were going into their heads. He needed to instill a culture that would be anti-intellectual. So the Nazis instituted a program to bring existing intellectual institutions under Nazi control. The process was called coordination. Professional organizations of doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers, etc. were incorporated into Nazi associations. Civic and charity organizations were made Nazi organizations. Universities, publishing companies, and writers were brought under Nazi direction. Some of the most notorious results of coordination. Many professors and students were radicalized. Hundreds of Democratic, Socialist, and Jewish authors were blacklisted. Any books that were labeled contrary to the German spirit, in other words, they presented ideas that weren't Nazi ideas, were banned and burned in public squares in front of cheering crowds. Modern art and architecture was labeled degenerate and prohibited. All of these efforts were in full swing by 1934. Hitler and racial hygiene. As extreme nationalists, the Nazis believed that true Germans could be identified by their biology, their abilities, and their behavior. This belief was straight out of social Darwinism, which we learned about in Lesson 22.4. Germany had suffered so much because the master race had been tainted and infected by the biologically, mentally, and socially inferior. To the Nazi mind, what better explanation could there be? Hitler believed that the master race had to be cleansed of its biological impurities. Jewish people, Slavic peoples, Gypsies, in other words, Roma people, Sinti, ethnic Romanians, the hereditarily ill, that's people with mental health issues, epileptics, people with mental disabilities called congenital feeble-mindedness, and people with physical disabilities. Hitler also believed that the master race had to be cleansed of its asocials and social deviants, homosexuals, in today's terms LGBTQ, Jehovah's Witnesses, common criminals, alcoholics, prostitutes, the work shy, their word for people who couldn't or wouldn't hold down a job, beggars, and vagrants. Two highly effective weapons that the Nazis used to persecute all of these people were science and law. Racism is much more palatable if it can be packaged as enlightened science. As we know, that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment itself. New university academies were created. For example, the German Society for Racial Research. And these academies took all kinds of weird measurements and wrote studies. Scientific information was presented in such varied forms as schoolroom lessons, movies, articles, and even board games. Nazi lawmakers wrote racism into the legal books. Outsiders were denied welfare benefits. Their jobs were taken away. Those with disabilities were put into segregated hospitals. Gay people and other asocials were put in concentration camps for re-education. In 1938, the Nazis started experimenting with euthanasia, mercy killing of people, including children, with chronic disabilities. They would simply load the kids into trucks and drive them off, leaving the staff to try to explain to the rest of the kids where their friends were going. The book, The White Rose by Inga Scholl, tells the true story of a hospital staff who told the remaining kids that their friends were going to heaven because they couldn't think of what else to say. The next day, when another truck came to get the rest of them, the kids got on board the truck singing. In another story from the same book, a soldier went off to war and came back to find that his own child had been euthanized. While he had been away on the front lines fighting for the Nazis had repaid him by murdering his child. As we will see in the next lesson, this program was a practice run for the Holocaust. Hitler and anti-Semitism. Hitler reserved a special hate in his heart for Jewish people, wherever they may be. Anyone he despised from afar was in his mind a Jew. Hitler methodically dialed up his legal persecution of Jews as time went on. Jewish people were portrayed in the media as ugly and evil. Movies and documentaries talked about the Jewish menace. Signs in businesses, banks, and parks said Juden unerwünscht, Jews not desired. In other words, you're not welcome in this establishment. In 1933, the Nazis passed the Professional Civil Service Restoration Act. This act banned Jews from working in any government jobs. By 1934, many Jewish lawyers, doctors, professors, civil servants, and musicians had been fired from their jobs. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed. These laws attacked Jewish lineage. Anyone who had 3 Jewish grandparents was a Jew, period. Marriage between Jews and Germans was outlawed. Jews were deprived of all rights of citizenship. What if you simply converted to Christianity and became a Christian? It didn't matter. In the eyes of the law, once a Jew, always a Jew. Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, 1938. All of this institutionalized hatred led up to a nationwide anti-Jewish riot on November 9th and 10th, 1938. It was a classic huge pogrom. We've seen these before, and this was a nationwide strike first. It was organized by Joseph Goebbels. 267 synagogues were destroyed, 1,400 more were damaged, 7,000 Jewish shops and department stores were damaged or destroyed, 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Hence, Kristallnacht ushered in a whole new phase of Nazi persecution. Years of anti-Semitism had been so programmed into the people that support for Kristallnacht was widespread. This description from the Daily Telegraph by journalist Hugh Green gives a good description of the event as well as attitudes about it. Mob law ruled in Berlin throughout the afternoon and evening as hordes of hooligans indulged in an orgy of destruction. I have seen several anti-Jewish outbreaks in Germany during the last 5 years, but never anything as nauseating as this. Racial hatred and hysteria seem to have taken complete hold of otherwise decent people. I saw fashionably dressed women clapping their hands and screaming with glee, while respectable middle-class mothers held up their babies to see the fun. This photograph that you see here is really illuminating, and it kind of captures the mood and the racism that were going on there. And what you see in this photograph is a Jewish business that's been completely destroyed and trashed. And the two people in the foreground at the bottom left, they're smiling, they're laughing, and she's looking at the camera and kind of showing off how she feels about this. Popular support for Nazism. Why did millions of ordinary, good people support a regime that was so thoroughly authoritarian, hateful, brutal, and racist? If you weren't Jewish, communist, or another one of the targeted groups we've mentioned, you likely personally benefited from Hitler's evil. Aryanization made a lot of Germans wealthier. Many Jewish people were forced to leave their jobs and sell their homes and businesses, and those Germans who stepped in and took their places didn't complain. Instead of seeing what they were doing as persecution and exploitation, they saw it as proof that the Nazis were the real deal. Hitler delivered on the economy. Hitler's public works programs got Germany out of the Depression. He built superhighways and sports stadiums and public housing. And these programs created lots of employment. By 1938, unemployment was 2%. People's standard of living was going up. Business profits were also going up. Luxuries and consumer goods. The economy produced a huge amount of affordable consumer goods for regular people. Radios, appliances, all kinds of personal products. Hitler kept the production of consumer goods and luxury goods for the people going long into the war, much longer than he should have. He thought it bad for his popularity if the German people should suffer from deprivation and scarcity as they had in World War I. The Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. The Nazis were very intentional about getting Germans involved in their exclusive society. The Hitler Youth, the League of German Women, the German Labor Front, mass rallies, May Day celebrations. These things provided a sense of belonging and community. The role of women in Nazi Germany. The Nazis promised to liberate women from women's liberation, and they championed a return to family values. They banned abortion. They discouraged women from working. They discouraged higher education for women. They glorified staying at home and being a mother. Women volunteered for all kinds of Nazi mass organizations, and these organizations organized charity drives and other programs. Women were not encouraged to work until the late 1930s when Germany faced severe labor shortages. Nazi resistance. Many groups actively resisted Hitler as early as 1933. Tens of thousands were imprisoned and thousands were executed. The biggest problem they had was unifying. Communists and socialists were the first to resist Nazism, but the SS dealt with them pretty quickly and efficiently. The Catholic and Protestant churches. Churches mainly sought to protect the religious life of Germans. They didn't look to overthrow Hitler. Some, like pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, actively resisted Nazi evil on moral grounds. Bonhoeffer was sent to a concentration camp and killed. High-ranking army officers. Several of the German army's highest officials plotted to kill Hitler, especially as he grew more aggressive and reckless. There were at least 42 known plots to kill Hitler. Many of these involved the army. All attempts failed. Aggression and appeasement. Hitler's domestic agenda for purifying a master race of Germans and creating a Volksgemeinschaft went hand in hand with territorial expansion of that master race. We Americans tend to think Hitler's greatest ambitions were in the places where we fought him: Italy, France, Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, etc. But that's not accurate. Hitler's greatest territorial ambitions and dreams lay eastward: Poland, the Baltic, Russia, Romania. And of course, this meant displacing and enslaving and replacing all the inferior peoples who already lived there. To the east were the grain, meat, oil, and other resources Hitler's army needed. Hitler also had a desire to expand Lebensraum, living space, in the only direction not blocked by an ocean, channel, or sea. Hitler's vision was that once he won the war, the entire fertile area between the Ural Mountains and Poland would be full of beautiful big cities populated only by racially pure Germans. Their food would be supplied by Slav peasants. Slavs would work the land and raise the cattle. They would eat scraps. They would be educated only enough to be able to follow orders. Hitler needed to go step by cautious step. He also had to conceal his ultimate intentions, and this meant that he had to start while he was still militarily weak. In 1933, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations. Germany had been allowed to join back in 1926. In March 1935, Hitler declared that Germany would no longer honor the disarmament clauses of the Treaty of Versailles. This meant that Hitler was giving himself permission to expand his military way beyond the limits specified in the treaty. Hitler began rebuilding his military. He also imposed a draft. Britain and France protested and warned against future aggressive actions. However, no one took any actions against Hitler, and this lack of action only made Hitler bolder. Britain adopted a policy toward Hitler called appeasement. Hitler could see that Britain wanted to avoid a war at all costs. They had not forgotten the horrors of World War I, and there was a large spirit of pacifism among the British people. Hitler, on the other hand, remembered World War I fondly. France was in favor of taking a much harder line with Germany. However, they could not do it without Britain backing them up. So the French had to go along with Britain's appeasement policy. Another thing that drove appeasement was the view that Stalin was the greater danger. Anti-communist feelings were strong, and Hitler was seen as a potential bulwark between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. The policy greatly underestimated Hitler to his advantage. In March 1936, Hitler occupied the Rhineland militarily. According to the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland, an area of Germany along the French border, we've seen it before, was supposed to remain demilitarized. But then Hitler had already announced 1 year earlier that he was not going to honor the military part of the Treaty of Versailles. Once again, France wanted to take military action, but once again, Britain did not. So once again, France had no choice but to go along with Britain's appeasement policy. And again, Hitler assured all parties that this was the only thing he wanted. And again, Hitler was emboldened by the inaction of Britain and France. Also, over the course of the late 1930s, Germany, Italy, and Japan all signed a succession of military treaties that formed the Axis Alliance, or Axis Coalition, same thing. And this Axis Alliance consisted of several significant pacts. Japan was also under the rule of a fascist dictator. More about that in Lesson 27.5. Hitler and Mussolini came fairly close to enlisting a fourth fascist dictator into the Axis powers, the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. Spain had become a very unstable democratic republic in 1931. And in 1936, a socialist coalition government was trying to get Spain on its feet. Army leaders backed by wealthy families and the Catholic hierarchy launched a rebellion against both the democracy and the socialism of the republic, and they had chosen Francisco Franco as their leader. Francisco Franco was a different kind of fascist than Hitler or Mussolini. Instead of being brash and reckless, Franco was cautious, methodical, strategic, and patient. Unlike Hitler and Mussolini, who tended to be overly optimistic about their capabilities, Franco was realistic from the beginning about how long and difficult this Spanish Civil War would be. The conflict was savage on the part of both sides. The Republic was hostile toward the church. Republican forces wanted to seize church property, and they murdered about 10,000 priests, nuns, bishops, and monks. The Spanish Civil War lasted 4 years and killed 500,000 people, and tens of thousands of refugees fled into France. Franco asked for and got military aid from both Hitler and Mussolini. In 1937, Hitler bombed the town of Guernica, killing anywhere between 150 and 1,650 people. In 1938, Mussolini bombed the city of Barcelona over the course of 2 days. Mussolini wanted to impress Hitler with his military power, but once the civilian casualties hit 1,300, the Pope, Franco himself, and even Hitler himself demanded that he stop immediately. When the war finally ended, Franco vowed never to pick up a sword again unless it was in defense of his country. Hitler urged Franco to bring Spain into the Axis, and Franco refused at first, but then demanded lots of economic help and the territory of Morocco in exchange or no deal. Hitler personally traveled to the town of Hendaye in 1940 to beg Franco to join the Axis alliance. He begged Franco for 9 hours, but he could not let Franco have Morocco because it would outrage the French Nazi Vichy government. Hitler commented to Mussolini that Francisco Franco was making, quote, the biggest mistake of his life, not joining the Axis powers. On the other hand, Hitler and Mussolini both died violently in 1945, whereas Francisco Franco died in his own bed in 1975 at the age of 82. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in a move called the Anschluss, which simply means annexation. Austria became part of Greater Germany, and Hitler did it without firing a single shot. He simply threatened Austria with invasion, and the Austrian government had no other options. At the same time, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland. This was a German-speaking ring around the western half of the country of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, along with a French delegation, met Hitler at the Munich conference and signed the Munich Agreement. In this agreement, Britain and France agreed to let Hitler have the Sudetenland at the expense of Czechoslovakia. In exchange, Hitler once again promised that Germany would be completely satisfied by this agreement and expand no more. Once again, Britain had exercised appeasement with Hitler and had gotten nothing in return. Neville Chamberlain, on the other hand, flew back to England, got off the plane, and congratulated himself in front of all the cameras for negotiating peace in our time. Just a few months later, in 1939, Hitler invaded the entire rest of Czechoslovakia, including the parts where only ethnic Czechs and Slovaks lived. The Czechs and Slovaks in this territory were now captive peoples. The British and the French were livid. Hitler then proposed invading the northern part of Poland because ethnic Germans lived in the area of the city of Danzig. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain promised that Britain and France would fight for sure if Hitler tried it. However, Hitler had no concrete reason by this point to believe Chamberlain. In August of 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. They launched a military plan to invade Poland and split it between themselves, and the Soviet Union would also invade the Baltic states and Finland. Germany would also invade Romania. This time, Britain and France declared war on Germany. However, they had appeased Hitler too many times for this war to be an easy win. Hitler and Mussolini. Hitler and Mussolini were similar in several ways. They both relied on violent gangs to seize power. They both intimidated their parliaments. They both strengthened and abused their authority. They both subjugated the civil service. They both loved and employed spectacle. They both insisted that the leader, They could do no wrong, and they both allowed their troops to brutalize conquered peoples. But they were also different, as well as incompatible. They met a little over a dozen times between June 1934 and July 1944. Their personal relationship was awkward and full of misunderstandings. As an Italian, Mussolini did not share Hitler's Nordic-based sense of racial superiority. He privately called Hitler's racist ideas stupid and unbecoming of a European leader. While Hitler delegated the tedium of governing to others, Mussolini actually enjoyed governing. He wasn't very good at it, but he was too arrogant to know that. He held as many as 6 of his own cabinet positions at once. Although Mussolini had resorted to violence and killing to gain power, he did not conduct purges once in office. Hitler, on the other hand, had no problem having hundreds of his own supporters killed. Even Mussolini could be shocked by Hitler's brutality and total lack of conscience. Germany and Italy were not really compatible allies. Italy did not have nearly the economic resources that Germany had. For example, Italy was almost completely dependent upon imported fertilizer and coal. While Hitler built a massively powerful war machine, Mussolini was never able to do the same. In 1939, Mussolini's war minister estimated that Italy might actually be ready for combat by 1949. Italy actually put fewer soldiers in the field during World War II than it had during World War I, even though Italy had a 20% higher population. When Mussolini tried to invade Greece from his Albanian territory, Greek defenders actually pushed his invasion force back 30 miles inside the Albanian border. His invasion force actually went in reverse. Hitler had to help Mussolini in Greece, which delayed his invasion of the Soviet Union, shortening his operational time down to just 4 months before the Russian winter would set in. This may have cost Hitler the war against the Soviets. But perhaps the biggest difference between Mussolini and Hitler was that Mussolini could repent and accept the reality of his defeat. The Italian people had never liked being allied with Hitler, and by 1943, it was clear that the Axis powers were defeated in North Africa and that an Allied invasion of Italy was imminent. Mussolini's own fascist party rebelled against him. They insisted that the parliament and the monarch be restored to full power. Mussolini accepted that the people no longer supported him, and he submitted his resignation to King Victor Emmanuel III, who accepted it unconditionally. Italy got an armistice between itself and the Allied invaders. After 2 decades as Italy's fascist dictator, Mussolini was done with politics for the moment. Hitler wasn't done with him yet. Hitler's attitude toward Mussolini was more like, it's over when I say it's over. Mussolini was still going to be killed by communist partisans in 1945. But that's all another story.